When you were playing that record, what were you thinking?
I'm Manjot, and I'm the editor of JugniStyle.com and producer of the Nameless Collective Podcast. Thank you for joining us today at Monsoon Arts Festival for our Samosa Politics Press Conference, also known as Storytelling and the Making of a History Podcast, a conversation with the Nameless Collective. We're joining you today from a beautiful backyard located in one of my favorite places in the entire world, Burnaby, located on land that is within the shared traditional and unceded territory of the Coast Salish peoples. I'm joined today by three brilliant, creative, and occasionally funny people, the hosts and researchers behind the Nameless Collective Podcast. Paneet Singh is a playwright and filmmaker, Naveen Girn, an award-winning curator and historian, and Dr. Milan Singh, researcher and community historian. Ours is a storytelling podcast that looks at Vancouver and this region's history through a South Asian lens. The hosts uncover untold histories, solve the occasional mystery, and delve into the spaces left empty by the official government archives. Today we're talking about some rumors and gossip that we've kept out of our recordings, and a bit about making a podcast, and why it's important to critique model minority myths. This conversation is also being recorded for a live podcast episode. Naveen, Paneet, and Milan, thank you for joining me today for this podcast.
Thank you for having us, despite that questionable introduction.
Why?
That took at least a few jabs at our integrity.
Hey guys,
And our sense of humor.
Yeah.
do you not all love Burnaby as much as I do?
B-Town represent.
Yeah,
I'm
exactly.
here
Best
for
of both worlds.
It is the best of both worlds. It's one of my favorite places in the world. Okay, so let's start the conversation. There are some stories and details that haven't been shared on the podcast, but we've promised our audience out there that we're going to give some gossip and rumors today. So spill the jar, please.
Oh my goodness.
Let's start with you, Naveen.
All right. So during the course of the interviews that we've done for the various projects that we've worked on, we get a chance to really talk with community elders. And so one thing that's been shared with me by a couple of people has been about this gap in the archive that all of us have noticed, which is that in the Gurdwara documents, oh God, I can't believe I'm saying this. In the Gurdwara documents, there's a big gap in terms of, in the early 1900 time period, you get some, minutes from meetings and things like that. But for about a few decades, you don't have anything. And in terms of financial documents or meeting minutes or resolutions that were passed, it's kind of shady where all that stuff went. And so I spoke to a community elder about this earlier, and with a couple of them. And both of them mentioned the same thing, which is that at some time during the late 1960s and early 1970s, all of these documents from 2nd Avenue Gurdwara were bundled together and buried under the Nishan Sahib at Ross Street Temple. Now, I heard this from two separate people. And so I'm like, when I first heard of it, I was like, why would you do this?
Like a time capsule.
Like a time capsule, but why would you bury all these really valuable and important historical documents under the Nishan Sahib? And then I was like, was there a ceremony? Are there any photographs of this? Was anyone there when they saw this? No one remembers seeing this, that I've talked to at least. So then I came to the conclusion that maybe this is a metaphor that was used instead, that the Nishan Sahib or the community is, the Nishan Sahib is sort of growing from, or the base of the foundation of that is the history and the legacy of 2nd Avenue Gurdwara, as opposed to a physical bundle of documents that please do not go to Ross Street Temple after hearing this and dig up under the Nishan Sahib.
Naveen's inciting a riot.
Don't do it. Don't do it. I'm not saying that. I don't think it's real. But this is a rumor that I've heard from multiple people over many different years.
Interesting. Why don't you think it's real?
I mean, I don't think it's real because I think someone at that time period would have realized how important these documents were. And I know that this gets spit into samosa politics and maybe even temple politics in terms of financial documents and all that sort of stuff, which I won't comment on. But there were other valuable documents there from that would have been we would never access to, like right to vote documents, women's immigration documents, all these documents about labor rights. They would have all been interned forever in cement under the Ross Street Temple. I don't know if that would be a really valuable thing for the community to do. So I don't think it's true, but that's what I've heard.
And the other, there's also, we've heard it from, I think, more than two people, if I'm thinking correctly. I'm thinking of the same two people you're thinking about. But
Wink,
the other
wink.
thing is like no one can point to like this is when they did it or this is who did it, and yeah, it is interesting.
Yeah. It kind of reminds me in high school when so I started a rumor about that the next major play that we're gonna work on was a musical of Greece, and then I heard it like come around to me afterwards that we're doing this musical of Greece, and I was like, oh, I started that rumor. And I think it's something similar about this rumor about something's buried under the Ross Street Temple, where it's like
So no one's actually said it.
No one's
He's
actually
just
said it.
starting the rumor,
someone
right?
No, I've heard from other people, but I'm seeing like one person might have said it back in the 70s, and then it's sort of made its way around in the community that there's something buried underneath there. There would have been something. I mean, I've spoken to people who were involved with Arthur Erickson's architectural team, and there's nothing in those documents about something being buried. There's no pictures of this ever happening. I don't think it's
Okay, now I want a juicier story than possibly there are documents buried under the Nishan Sab at the Gurdwara.
Okay, well, I want to ask these two if this is actually a rumor or not.
Okay.
And it's William C. Hopkinson's shack on Fraser that helped him shift into his disguise so he could better infiltrate the South Asian community. Is this true or is this not true? Because I can't tell where I read it, but I've said this story before. And so this is some of the tension of like, is this actually something that we've created as a rumor to become true in our minds as part of the narrative or whatnot? So I want to actually throw it back at you two. So was there really a shack on Fraser Street?
Well, I think the three of us have talked about it, and it seems ridiculous that
It does seem ridiculous.
like, okay, Hopkinson, who is defined by this term of swarthy, which, when you read like biographies of him, they always say a swarthy complexion man, but which means like darker. Yeah, okay, but first of all, how good is Hopkinson's hair and makeup department at his house that they can get away with getting the most notoriously hated man within the South Asian community disguised so well and so frequently that they can't identify who he is? Like what?
If I could just add to that, Paneet, he's also an immigration inspector, so he must have met them when they entered into the country. So like one of the first people you meet is Hopkinson, and then he has blackface makeup, and that's what he's doing.
And those ears, man, like we've been able to pick him out from his ears.
Yeah, he's a tall guy too.
So, I mean, you guys are the history experts on the team. Like, wasn't he known for dressing up and being a spy? So how was he then not actually effective? Is that what you're saying?
Well, I read it in a book. I read it in a book called White Man's Country, and it was written by this white journalist and it might be something around the fact that it plays up the espionage aspect of Hopkinson's character, where he was a master of disguise and he traveled back and forth along the coast. But I don't think that's what we think. He'd be so recognizable.
Well, okay, so here's the other thing then, is like I think even Hugh Johnston mentions it in Continuous Voyage, whatever it's called, the most important book on Peru, but whatever, Google it. I think he mentions it, but the thing is, and now like we've come across it in primary source documents because at Milan Singh's trial, they mention that Hopkinson does this, and nobody offers a counterpoint. Nobody's like, no, it never happened, or nobody says like the validity of that claim is never called into question.
I would just love if there was like a comedy sketch where it's like Hopkinson in disguise and all the upname know it's Hopkinson, so they intentionally go around him and say the most like outrageous things because he stand out so much.
Yeah. I love it. It's like, did you hear about the bomb shipment from Lahore? He's like, no, and he's like doing a really bad job. His mustache is falling off his face, and he's like, really?
What would Hopkinson's name be if he was undercover?
They have his name.
I can't remember what it is,
okay.
but he does have it on.
Everyone says what his name was.
Okay.
And that's the thing. It's like you've heard about the documents being buried from a few elders. We've seen this like Hopkinson sort of rumor enter in books and in the archive in an interesting sort of way. So the validity of it really throws me off because you're like, okay, really? He was like shacking up in a shack to like get on this gear? Like, what's going on?
But you know what? It does make me think. I feel like it's like where there's smoke, there's fire kind of thing. But like, is there usually a political motivation for a rumor to form and then to like proliferate? Because if I'm thinking back to like Hopkinson's time, is it a scare tactic to be like, hey, he's amongst you and you don't even know? That's how good we are. So it's like it's given this validity by the government, perhaps. Though, because the thing is, I think Milan Singh repeats it in his statement as well, that like, yeah, Hopkinson spies on our community and like dresses up or something like that. I think he mentions it. Don't quote me on that. But the other thing, thinking back to the flagpole thing, it's an interesting claim because in 1969, 1970, when the move's happening from 2nd Avenue to Ross Street, there's also a huge shift in migration, right? Like this is it's going to be like the start of tensions between the new guard and the old guard, like Punjabi Sikhs coming from Punjab, and like they have very different sensibilities. They grew up with very different understandings of their religious practice and of their customs, and so there's a lot of tension. And like the first kind of really contentious Gurdwara elections happened during that time, and they happen like right around the time of like fighting about the building management of the Ross Street Gurdwara. And so there's this idea of like who this history belongs to or who gets to dictate what's happening in the space. So because there's another rumor I've heard.
Okay.
And I've never dropped this one on you guys, I don't think. And I don't know if you're ready for it.
Ready for it. Always ready for it.
So in that exact same time as the documents under the Nishan Sahib thing, what happens is that there's like a lot of new migrants from Punjab who are, I guess, like over the years will probably be labeled as like the fundamentalist camp that comes to be, right?
Okay.
In the 90s in Gurdwara politics. But they were like, okay, so the people that lived here before, what they wanted to do was not, and this is totally incongruous with what we know about what happens with 2nd Avenue after the Gurdwara thing, is like, what they wanted to do was they wanted Ross Street not to exclusively be a Gurdwara, because these people had no idea how Sikhi is practiced. What they wanted to do was they wanted to also build a banquet hall.
Oh my God.
And they wanted to put the palki of Guru Granth Sahib, the throne of Guru Granth Sahib, on wheels, so at nighttime you could wheel it out and convert Ross Street Gurdwara into a banquet hall where you could have receptions.
Wait,
No
who,
way.
who wanted this? The
This-
new
thi-
immigrants?
No,
Older.
yeah.
Okay.
Yeah,
The originals.
The originals, yes. And they're like, but they're a bunch of atheists and blah, blah, blah. And so that's why we had this election to fight over it. And then, because we won the election and then we managed the building management,
Yeah.
which I also don't know the history of, so it's weird. Then they were like, okay, fine. Well, we've had this Gurdwara at 2nd Avenue for so long. We're just going to turn that into a banquet hall because we're not using it as a Gurdwara anymore. And then they're like, well, that's horrific. Why would you turn our Gurdwara into a banquet hall? So secretly, overnight, they orchestrated the selling of it.
No.
It's what I've heard from one person. About 9 years ago.
Oh my God. Wow.
That's such a juicy story.
Just gonna, now we're all like jaw dropped. We're like, okay, what are we gonna do?
But so
Yeah.
like this thing about like bringing it under the Nishan Sahib and like it's all of like probably like laying claim to like validity to
Totally.
power.
Yeah. Totally. Wow, that's fascinating. I have to think about that one.
That's really
You guys weren't ready for
That's
that.
No,
were
I
you?
wasn't.
You were not ready.
No, Manjot told us to spill the cha, and we just made a big old mess.
Just like bam, there you go. Job for everyone.
Well, maybe I'll move the conversation into slightly safer rumors. So going back to Hopkinson, I received in the first year or the first season of the podcast, I received an email from a listener who said that there was little or no evidence that Hopkinson was Anglo-Indian or half white and half Indian. And so you guys have obviously talked a lot about Hopkinson on both seasons of the podcast, but he's also written a play that talks or features Hopkinson in quite a big deal. So is there any proof that Hopkinson is in fact a brown guy, particularly when he seemed to spend so much time like being white or trying to be white? Like, where is the foundation for this idea that Hopkinson was actually an Anglo-Indian who migrated to Canada?
Can we throw this to our document genius, Milan?
Sure, because
You'll give me the hard one, right?
because wasn't his personal narrative that he was from England?
Yeah. But that's like, so his personal narrative was that he was British, right? And so he had really done a lot of work to create, as you were saying, an identity around being white and being for, British India, being for British Canada, being for that, like, representing that identity. What was, for me, I read the piece around him being an Anglo-Indian in Hugh Johnson's book, in Voyage of the Komagata.
That's the book name.
Thank you. I'm sorry, Hugh Johnson.
And so what is really fascinating for me about that piece is that I wonder if there was just a different, like an interpretation of that term Anglo-Indian. Maybe he was mixed. Maybe there was other aspects of it, because there was also that interesting part about him being able to speak Hindi fluently as well, right? And so it's like, okay, are we calling him an Anglo-Indian because he was a full-on white, or maybe he was actually half Indian? And that's some of what we talk about as well in the podcast. So I'm going to start off there, and I'm going to throw it at you guys, and then jump back in.
This is interesting because, like, I don't know if there's documentation to support it, right? And I think Milan raised a really valid point of like how has the term changed over time, or how's it reinterpreted, or whatever. So my inclination becomes to think that, okay, what are the hints in the documentation? In his death certificate, we've talked about this on the podcast. In Hopkinson's death certificate, he's cremated, right? A few blocks down from where VGH is now. But that's a really big question mark for me to start with. The other thing is that I've not come across my in my reading any scholar who's argued that he's not, right? And I think, and this is obviously a slippery slope, because this is a really stupid argument to say. It's like, well, prove it doesn't exist, right? It's not a great place to put your footing. But I think, and this actually, and we've had a similar kind of experience, if I can call to it, with some of the stories that we shared, where it's like, well, we've never heard this story before, and so therefore it's not valid, or we haven't seen this documented before, therefore it's not valid. Why are we now just hearing it in 2019 or whatever? We've heard this before about some of the things that we've talked about, and it's like, well, there was a lot of stuff happening off the table. I mean, the point of a lot of this was to keep things hidden, right? And Hopkinson obviously had a big stake in keeping things hidden. So there's that. I'm like, but can I point to a document or evidence back then that says that he's half Indian? I don't think I could.
Yeah. I mean, similar to what Milan and Paneet have said, I've never seen any definitive document that says he was Anglo-Indian, except for Hugh's book. But I'm curious about what purpose his Anglo-Indianness serves to the story, mostly to the Komagata story. And when it came out in the 70s, Hopkinson was that entry point for Gore and non-South Asians to be like, okay, now I can enter into the Komagata story. And so we see it not only in Hugh's book, but we also see it in the play that was done too. Her name...
Sharon Pollock.
Sharon Pollock's play, yeah. And so Hopkinson's Anglo-Indianness in that play is like the big reveal towards the end. But it's also like an entry point for a majority non-white, majority white audience, sorry, to be like, okay, here's one person we can enter this foreign story through. So the purpose of Hopkinson's Anglo-Indianness is also narratively and symbolically kind of important to the messaging of the Komagata.
Interesting. I'm going to switch it up to a question related to the community-based research that is really the basis of the podcast. So one of the challenges about this kind of research and storytelling is that sometimes you uncover stories about someone's ancestor that doesn't live up to the image that they have of them. And so some stories we omit from the podcast for that reason, have care for people's personal histories and ancestors and such. Why is that important to do?
Well, I'm going to jump in on that one. And it's important because it's not always our story to tell. And so often, yes, we try to challenge that rags to riches narrative, that, successful immigrant narrative by showing the nuance and the diversity within our communities. But at the end of the day, if there's living descendants and they have told their family story through their lens and their experience and want it presented that way, we really have to respect that. And so we can talk about sort of the context of how these things arrive. And you'll see that in the podcast a lot, right? We'll tell stories that situate the context around, Gother politics or around anti-British imperialism or around anti-colonialism or whiteness. But there, and you'll hear it, there is that hesitancy if we are to start telling a definitive narrative about someone's story. And I think that really is around the respect of people's stories and who's telling them.
Thanks for your response, Milan. So you brought up model minorities and the myths of model minority. Can you expand on that in relation to history and storytelling, particularly now as in the community we're talking a lot more about the myth of model minorities as we reflect on anti-Blackness within the South Asian community with the Black Lives Matter movement being so prevalent this year in 2020?
Well, I'll start and then I'll pass it on to these others. The model minority myth is a catch-22. Okay, we need to recognize it as something that forces us to always negotiate our positionality towards whiteness. And by doing that, we actually become anti-Black. And so we really need to call that out in our communities. But when as historians and when we see our communities being framed through this model minority myth, what it does is actually erases all the different experiences and contexts that our communities have had. It also erases the intersectional experiences of our communities across South Asian identities. It erases gendered identities, right? Because it also is in a very particular heteronormative framework. It erases any experience that the LGBTQ plus communities had, and it erases any other form of migration amongst the diaspora. So I'm going to be the myth drives me nuts, and when we perpetuate this sort of identity, because of all the erasure that it creates and also the whiteness that we end up performing as a result. And so it's difficult. It's difficult because we're constantly negotiating where we stand, but when you create this as the norm for our communities, what you end up doing is really causing harm.
Milan, can you give any example of what do you mean by the model minority myth, in terms of how we tell the story or how people tell the story of the South Asian community here?
Yeah, we arrived, we worked really hard, we persevered, but despite being paid less than white people, we ended up somehow accumulating wealth, so it's around economics mostly, and now we have then succeeded by buying big houses and living in the suburbs. That is the myth, and it's not how our communities always operate. It is a lifestyle, and it is the way many of us have lived, but it isn't the story.
No, it's really well said, Milan. And it brings up something that you mentioned earlier about the stories we hear sometimes from people who've been here several generations. Because some of the work that we try to do is when we hear these packaged stories about elders is how do we poke holes in it to find the actual human being. I can point to even back to some of our favorite people like Hussein Rahim, who had the Hindustani. And there was a contemporary paper that he had a beef with called the Sansad, right? And there's articles in there about, the editor of the Sansad paper hobnobs with the government leaders, hobnobs with the mayor of Victoria. So that's why he's he's not trustworthy. Whereas we, on the other hand, are freedom fighters. It's all this stuff is real and happened back then, right? And for instance, and I say this story often, but I want to illustrate a point with it, which is that there's an issue of the Hindustani paper where they organize a exhibition wrestling match between the quote-unquote champion of India, champion of Punjab, and the British champion, who's this Irish guy. And they hype it up for a big time. It's a big fight at Dominion Hall. And then the South Asian wrestler loses. And the reason they give on it is that if Canada let in, the best of India, we would be more successful. And I think there's something about this model minority myth and colonialism, that colonialism circumscribes the freedom of action of people, of who they can be, of who they can choose to be, what they can do, who they can love, all those things. And so that frustration finds angst. And so when you try to wipe out the angst, the frustration, the tensions that happened in the past in order to give this really, like Milan said, this really pure narrative to appeal to a white audience, that in itself becomes really detrimental to us looking at these people in our past as full humans who had all the range of emotions that humans do.
And I think that where this, I think Naveen and Milan answered it perfectly. I just want to add this one little point of and echoing what Milan said is that there's a lot of identifying with this thing of we got paid less than white people, we worked hard, we made it, blah blah blah, and the thing is, a lot of us have that experience. And so that's why we're like, well, the model minority myth, it's like, well, we've just done a good job. So like, why are you undercutting that? I think there needs to be a discerning between the personal and like the community and the macro, right? Yeah. It's like, yes, your mothers, your fathers, your great grandparents, your grandparents might have driven a taxi, whatever, and really and they did it despite the odds, and like they were found themselves economic stability, and like you're living a good, middle class life, cool. But that's the personal of it, right? That only happened because of the disturbing that the community was doing, because of the protests, the organization that was happening, because the taxi union was coming together, because they were speaking truth to power, right? So it wasn't the model minority like standing that got you here. It wasn't like, oh, I was on my best behavior all the time, so if I could. It's like, yeah, but you know what, there's 7 people that were going and losing their jobs and fighting so that our parents could do that, right? And so to be like, if they can put their heads down and work hard, and then we should all be able to, because we're just continuing the work, I think it's a red herring. Totally. It's like you're talking just about the personal. It's like, yes, I'm not telling you to not be a hardworking person despite the odds being against you, but I'm also not saying be complicit with like an inherently oppressive system.
I'm so glad you brought that up, because I think I find missing from so many of the stories that we've been told growing up, whether it was in magazines or on TV, when we would talk about like pioneers working really hard, like the idea of ongoing activism. It's just sort of the story is always there was some activism and then everything was great, and it's like everything's not great actually. And it's not like migration stopped and then the Canadian system became like non-colonial and is not racist anymore. All of that's existing, but I love what you said about the individual versus like the collective, because I think people sometimes get really stuck in, well, like, but I am a success, and it doesn't matter that new immigrants or refugees or anyone else are experiencing the exact same things that were happening 100 years ago or 50 years ago.
What it tells us is that the model minority myth, what it tells us is that the structure works, and that's the false claim, right? It's saying that you as a brown person can succeed in this white structure. And that is false, because we see that systemic racism and the structures that are in place actually cause so much harm and so much, exclusion for Indigenous, Black, and people of color. And that's, I really just need to make that super clear, is that's the equivalency. It's saying that, oh, it works and the system works, and the system does not work.
Absolutely. I want to bring up this term, pioneers. So in the podcast, none of you use that word, pioneers, but I hear it used constantly, like people who came in the early 1900s and work so hard, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. They are the pioneers of our community. The 3 of you, I think, use the term elders. Can you explain why is the term pioneers problematic, and why is that the case, and why do you use different terms?
I mean, pioneers is racist.
Why?
I mean, it presumes that there was something that was undiscovered that a pioneer had to go through and lay claim to. And it negates thousands of years of Indigenous history, not just in British Columbia, but in Canada. So we have really thoughtfully, before our podcast started, talked about why we aren't using the word pioneers. And it's been conversations we've all had, because to presume that one's elder is a pioneer, it plays into a lot of racist colonial stereotypes of clearing the land, building a home, but okay, well, whose land did you build this on? Who did you displace in order to build your house? All those things come into it. Elder, I think, still plays into the idea of having a familial ancestor who, came earlier to this country, and it still retains that sense of respect. But pioneer is really problematic.
Yeah, I think Naveen hit the nail on the head, and then like where I usually come in is with the language thing, is that if I'm looking to how I'm talking about like elders in Punjabi, these are the words that you're using. You're using bajorg, siane, vadde vadere, which means like the big ones before us, or for vadde vadere, or siane is like the wise. Yeah. Or bajorg, which literally means old, but like people will talk about, it's funny because people will talk about Kartar Singh Sarabha, who was martyred when he was 21, and be like, our bajorg, Kartar Singh Sarabha, which means old, right? But that's the language that we do use in our own languages. So,
or we'll make them family relations, like the terminology with the ups and whatnot, right, as well. But I don't like the word pioneer because it also it creates a starting point, and that's not the case. What we have found in our own history, and as we're doing this work, not only is it racist, of course, as Naveen said, but it also creates a timeline that is very catered to how we understand history through a white colonial lens. It's how we understand history through the archives, right? Here's a starting point, here's an end point. And if we were to be true to our podcast and be true to the stories around us, every person has a different starting point. Every person and every communities have different experiences here. So just last week, I sent Naveen and Paneet the text message of an image from White Rock, Surrey area, by Stewart's Farm, where there's still a bunkhouse that's up and running. And one of the images not up and running, I shouldn't say up and running, it's up, it hasn't been destroyed.
There was 47 guys living in it.
Holy smokes. It's not up and running, but they preserved it. So it's still standing. And this is at Stewart's Farm. And in one of the images of the different plaques that they have up, there's a brown person. There's a Sadat in there. And I was like, well, wait a second. If this is dating back to pre-1990, then it's kind of false if we start creating this, creating a start timeline in 1907 or 1908. We have to always leave room, because we don't know enough about our communities yet and the histories of our communities yet, that we have to leave room for other researchers, other historians, for other community members to tell their stories. And by positioning pioneers in this racist way and at a particular start time, it doesn't allow us to expand our identities and our stories. You didn't think we'd have so much passion around the word pioneer, did you?
No, I'm glad you did, because it's a term that, because we've talked about it behind closed doors, and it's a term that it's so commonly used when people talk about the past in our community and other communities, and so I wanted to talk about it. I want to talk about another term that's been being debated a bit over Twitter more recently, is the term South Asian, as an umbrella term for our community and our identities. And in the podcast, we use that South Asian quite a bit. And when we first launched the podcast, we had some comments from listeners who were saying, why are you using South Asian when the majority of the people who you're talking about were actually men who were Sikh, Punjabi? And so they felt like it was a problematic term to use. And some people do say South Asian is a homogenizing term. Others say it's a great term to gather people around and advocate as a larger body and find our similarities, etc. So please tell me, why do you use the term South Asian?
South Asian works for me for a couple of levels. One is at the time of history that we often talk about, the early 1900s. It's sometimes messy to be like, are we talking about British India, British Indians, Punjab, and then what do we mean by Punjab? Do we mean what's pre-partition Punjab or afterwards? So it becomes really a messy thing. I find that South Asian, for me at least, helps bring together all of those different ethnicities across time, but also the geography as well too, where sometimes we could talk about Fijians in our podcast as well too, and South Asian becomes a term that connects those communities and those people who come from that area of the world more so than something like Indian would or Punjabi would.
So I'm going to say the politics of naming for our community is something that I think we need to actually discuss. So when Naveen and I were working on Komagata Journey, the website and the archive there was a lot of tension actually around this very use of terminology. So, in the 80s, we used to use the term East Indians, then we started saying Indians, then we started saying Indo-Canadian, and sort of the media representation around Indo-Canadian became really problematic. And then the naming sort of switched to South Asian. And what we're going to see, and what I hope we see, is actually us really grappling with what our communities at large want to call ourselves. Other experiences have been with this term for me has been around South Asian. You'll hear me in the podcast and hear us in the podcast name Punjabi Sikh when we're speaking about individuals, and when we're talking about the community more largely, often we say South Asian. And so if, for example, we're speaking about the Punjabi Sikh history alone, we'll often name that. And I want to be, I think we've attempted to really name that. Even if we can't say certain names with in particular ways, we'll try our best to do so and to really name it. And this has also been on other projects that I've worked on, is if you're going to be telling the Punjabi Sikh narrative, name it. If you're going to be talking about this more expansively, like we have to in the podcast, because we're talking about a pre-partition India, we're talking about British India, we're talking about different groups in the diaspora and how they've moved, even though it centers and it anchors in the Punjabi Sikh community as the largest community that arrived, it doesn't mean that there aren't, for example, the Hussein Rahims or the Taraknath Dases that we talk about. And it's a way to actually show the intersectionality amongst the South Asian community for me.
And I think one thing that that's the one thing is I think if people if this is a concern, I suggest taking a second pass at the podcast and literally do a case study, and if we're wrong at places, we should be held accountable to it. But I think we're pretty specific with which term we're using at which time, or we try to be. At least we're candid when we're speaking, so obviously there's going to be errors made in what we intend to say and what we say. But I think, as Milan just named, is like we're specific about who we're talking about when it's important to be. And the other thing I think that I don't think we're stating is that we're not saying right now is that when we do say South Asian, we often pluralize the term that comes after it. South Asian histories, South Asian cultures, South Asian community groups. You know what I'm saying? Like, so we often put that as a plural because there is no South Asian culture. That's a misnomer. And that's the thing. It's like growing up, like I was very attuned to this idea of myself as a Sikh and being as like a minoritized community in India and what that means. And like, so being very vigilant about the fact that that name is not being erased, and I continue to be. For that very reason, is like, because sometimes South Asian can be, and sometimes is a term weaponized by like right-wing Hindu nationalist groups, because like, yeah, if we just say South Asian, then we can pretend like Muslims and Sikhs and Christians don't exist, right? And so like definitely there's problems associated with all the terminology, but I think that, like, not to give ourselves too much of a pat on the back, that we're pretty specific about it. And it goes both ways. I mean, I've gotten people angry because they're like, well, why did you say Meva Singh something and like refer to him as like a Sikh here? I was like, well, like, read everything Meva Singh said. I'm pretty sure if I said South Asian, he'd probably be pretty upset with me, right? Like, it makes sense. And it depends on the person and like kind of how we read them, how we analyze them, and the community, and like what's appropriate in that circumstance. I mean, the Gurdwara is a great example of Second Avenue. We talk about it often as a place of Sikh worship, but a gathering space for the South Asian community. And it very much serves both of those roles, and you have to name it in that way.
I mess up. I'm going to say I mess up regularly, and the reason being is because the terminology shifts on me. It's like the ground is moving under my feet. If I was to write about this 10 years ago when I was doing my research work, or I mean, it hasn't been 10 years ago, but when I started my research work, we would be often using the term Indo-Canadian. Like, it shifts very quickly, and it's not that I'm not aware of it. In fact, it's like, I think if we were to listen to the podcast in 5 years, we might actually even have shifted our own naming in it.
Yeah, that makes sense. One of the things is challenging with the podcast for me is that, so we already know that the official archives omit a lot of the stories of all communities of color, and Indigenous communities and Black communities. But what's even like the few pieces or documents or stories that we do know, it feels like the stories of women are further omitted. And so with the podcast, we've tried to bring in the stories of women like Harnaam Kaur and Annie Wright and others, but that's something that I'm challenged with. Like, when we put up the images for our podcast, it's always a guy every single time. And so how do you tell a story about a community that's not just all about men, when that's the information that you have?
It's the same problem we're facing in 2020. I'm just going to say it. It's, for some reason, the carriers of our knowledge and the images of our knowledge and our histories happen to be men. I working with Naveen and Paneet. It has been absolutely wonderful because they treat me as an equal. Our community, I'll call them out right now, they're the experts. I'm not. Right? Like, you'll hear, wow. You'll hear them being called on way before I'll get called on for something. And so it's a problem that we really need to address when it comes to gender across the board. Go for it, guys.
I think Dr. Milan Singh speaks for itself, I think.
But that's it, right? Like, so I don't need the doctor to be flaunted by any means, but we have to use that as leverage for me, but we don't have to do that for anyone else.
Which is ridiculous. It's really irritating and annoying because Milan has such a deep foundation and passion for the history and brings so much knowledge to the podcast, but the fact that the two men on the team get more of the credit publicly is really frustrating. It's also not new. I mean, it's something that I faced in my own career outside of the podcast, and it's really frustrating, and I feel like really mad that you just said that, Milan. I feel mad that happens to you. The thing that I wanted to get at here, guys, is like, we only have a couple of women's stories. Like, does that mean we are not doing a good enough job finding those other stories? Like, I also know there were way less women, like, because of the way immigration was capped and such, they were keeping women out. But, like, does that mean, like, should we be shifting to a new era or a new phase when women were coming in? Like, what can we do better to be more representative? Because sometimes the stories are really interesting that you share, but I'm also like, I'd love to hear more about the women.
I think what you said is a big solve, and it addresses not just the gender issue, but many, which is we privilege the earliest stories much more than the 100 years that followed, and I think the four of us have had this kind of cognizance that we do want to center women's stories and not men's stories when we can. Obviously, the era that we're in right now with Nameless is like it lends itself towards one thing, but and I think when Naveen and I were working on the Ocean of Peace exhibition at New West, it was this idea of like, okay, the stories are all about men, but most of our interviewees are women, and most of the carriers of the story are women. So like there was this idea, is like, well, at least let's put this in their voice without us informing it, right? And like that's a starting point. But I do think that like moving outside of that like up until 1930 time is a big piece of this, because it's not the only thing that happened. It's not necessarily the most important thing that happened, however you want to qualify that. Because I mean, like the Mrs. Naseeb Kaur Puris, the Mrs. Harjeet Dhillons of the world, upon whose like labor and like efforts and existence that we do all of our work on, very much need to be centralized. And like it's hard. And the other thing is like it's hard for us as four people doing this off the side of our desks to make that our mission, or like as a part of like to build that into what we do. And we can do it to as much as we do everything else, but it's really on us, especially like these rags to riches stories, if I can call out that again, is like these rags to riches stories, because they're so much about economic stability and the labor that got us there, then they're obviously going to be geared towards a certain narrative, and that's going to be targeted towards men. And I think and they're the ones that are the ones that are usually profiting and making a living off of this, and we're not, for the most part. So it's like, I think it's on those organizations to interrogate as well.
Well, what I wanted to know then, does this mean that the three of you will be delving into other decades of history soon? Can we expect that from the podcast in the future?
Ask our producer.
She tells us what to do.
Oh, God.
I hope so. And it's because, I mean, it attaches to the earlier question that you asked, or the previous question that you asked. It took years for me to be able to really piece together the Harnam Kaur story in the way that it is now, and that's because it doesn't exist in the archive. We had to look at shipping records from Hong Kong, shipping records from San Francisco. We had to look at Paneet was doing all the translation from the Gurdwara ledgers for us, and from the art. Like, there's just so many things that we had to start looking at. And once you, and like as a researcher in our community, and this is for the researchers out there, really, you need, in order to triangulate your research, you need at least 2 or 3 points that intersect. And it's actually really difficult for us to find those, because then if you have, for example, name, date, time, you can then figure out the journey. If you have name of ship and you have the person's name, but you don't necessarily have like a year, then you're able to try to figure out and work backwards or work forwards to figure that out. So the labor that it takes in order to find a sentence of Harnamkor's story, or in order to find a little nugget, is because you have to do so much triangulation work because the information doesn't exist. So if you have a name and kind of like a hypothetical year, that doesn't really help either. You need sort of like 2 facts that'll help guide the work. And that's on the technical side a little bit, but I think if any researchers are listening, it's a question I get all the time. How do we do this work? Like, how can we actually dive into this stuff when you don't even know where to start half the time? And it becomes quite difficult. So I really do hope that we can move forward and into forward meaning timeline, not forward in other ways, because like we're stuck where we at. But just recognizing for us like the sheer amount of labor that it takes for us to move those inches.
I'm really glad you brought up the type of work that went into putting together the narrative around Harnamkor, because a lot of people like myself, I'm not a researcher, so I didn't realize that was the level of work that went into getting that story. And I think that's really important to share with everyone. And for people who don't know, Milan worked on a graphic narrative around Harnamkor story with the artist Girn. Is that available publicly?
Yeah, there's a digital piece on Such a Canada right now, but we'll make it available maybe on Jugni Style.
Sure, we can make it available on jugnistyle.com. It's a really beautiful story visually as well. Yeah. So I'm going to wrap it up. I have like one question. Back to rumors and gossip. We're in really heavy content right now, but the rumors and gossip part is actually my absolute favorite part of the podcast. So it always like crushes me when we have to cut something from the recording. So we know, anyone who's listened to the podcast or is slightly aware of South Asian history in BC will know that the Komagataru ship didn't travel here directly because it was challenging the Continuous Journey Act. Is that right? Regulation. Okay. So the ship made some stops along the way, and I have in my notes here, correct me if I'm wrong, stopped in Hong Kong, passengers contracted syphilis. I've never heard this public. I've read, I've seen, I've watched documentaries, I've read books. I've never seen this before.
Oh.
Where did this come from? Like, how come this wasn't part of Ali Kazemi's documentary on the Komagataru journey? Or is it just a rumor? I don't know. You tell me.
So, I think this is a nice wrap up place, because it all comes down to like this idea of like rags to riches, framing, colonialism, like pioneer. This all kind of comes into the same umbrella.
Yeah.
This is easily accessible, this information. Hugh Johnston wrote it in Voyage of the Komagataru. It's there. It's written. It's been around since what, 1978 when he wrote it or whatever it was. So the information is there. It's always been public. No one's ever talked about it. It's like it's a sentence or like a paragraph in the book, but it's there. It's like anyone can read it, but we don't talk about it.
So context, Paneet. So what's the sentence paragraph?
Yes. Okay. So it talks about how like these about how in, I believe it's Hong Kong, or one of the East Asian countries that the ship stopped in, that a few of the men visited, and I think they used their terms red light district of Hong Kong, and they came back to the ship and they had contracted, if I recall, venereal diseases, right? And then they were very heavily reprimanded by Baba Gurditt Singh, the charter of the ship, for what they did. Like that's about all it comes up. It's not like everyone got syphilis on the ship. It was like a group of men who went out and did this. And so, if I recall it correctly, and I'll pass it to you two now.
Paneet, as our sexual diseases expert.
Yeah.
Well, I think part of it, so that story is interesting because, like what you said is the Rags to Riches story. The Komagataru the story's been told and retold and apologized for like a million times now. And it's like such a revered story. Like all the like everyone on that ship is seen as like some kind of almost like saint-like person, quality for being on a ship. And so, like, it totally makes sense for the story about STDs to not make it out there, even though it's like probably one of the most interesting points of that journey, but not the most interesting, I guess. But also, I think, like, when I'm thinking about like sexuality and how we don't talk about sexuality in our communities, so it'd also be like the most horrible thing to to talk about. Also, I think, like, do you think that plays into that as well?
Well, absolutely. I mean, it plays into everything Paneet mentioned and you've mentioned. Also, I guess it like colonial era documents as well too would come into it as well, and how disease was seen. But I mean, it goes back to something that I've talked about earlier, and I think all of us share, is this idea that these were humans on that ship who had human needs and human desires and human failings, if you want to call it that. I don't think I would call it that, but people did what they did. They're out of the country for the very first time in a new country. They want to go explore and see what's out there. And yeah, so some of them may have got this disease. So it happens. And I think it actually makes the story of the Kamagadamu a lot more richer than, like you were saying, Manjot, a bunch of saints who crossed the ship, crossed the ocean to challenge this unjust law, and were denied access. Like there's a lot more to that story, and a lot more to the afterlife of those passengers as well too, that I think we should delve into.
You know, for me, it does. It creates a human side to the stories that we often end up extracting when we create, you know, these auras around experiences or stories, right? I think, I don't know if aura is the right term, but it kind of creates this like halo effect of what these struggles did for the rest of us, right? Where we always have to pay gratitude. And it's slightly different, but I mean, even me challenging the fact that the Komagadamu wasn't the first ship to really push the continuous journey regulation, sometimes people are fearful of that. It's like, but the regulation was on, you know, it came onto the books. It came onto the books in 1908, and it stayed on until 1947. Of course, there were many ships. Of course, there were many people who ended up being pushed away or experienced the racism when they arrived. But when we talk about this isolated incident, when we talk about the Komagadamu as an isolated incident, what it does is it also strips away any of the humanity that was around it or that resulted before or after it, whether it was around disease or whether it's women's stories or whether it's Harnam Kaur was challenged the continuous journey regulation.
Yeah, that's right.
So the women's stories that challenge the ship are also erased. So it's so many of the human elements that end up getting removed that really end up becoming kind of heartbreaking for us. Like, it's sad. I don't know how else to describe it in simple emotional terms. It's sad, man.
Yeah. And I think the knee-jerk reaction or the inclination to want to ignore stories that are uncomfortable for us, I think that's the word we can all agree on, right? Some people are going to call it immoral, some people are going to call it unethical, some people are going to call it lies, probably, but it's uncomfortable. That's I think the common denominator. And the thing is, when you start stripping away these uncomfortable moments, you lose a lot of the nuance in the discussion, in a way that, like, that discussion cannot be constructive anymore. And I understand the inclination, because everyone loves to say that this person in my village was on the Kamagadamu. Did you know that? This person in my family was on the Kamagadamu. This person borrowed money to go on the Kamagadamu. Like, it's a point that we all want to get to. And I'll share something very personal, and we'll see how it goes. Because a lot, what Milan said is that and I agree, that we can't always share the uncomfortable stories because of how people see themselves and their families, and that's okay, right? I mean, there'll be a time and a place for those stories as well. We also have a service to the community that we are consciously doing, or trying to consciously do. But as people look inward and reflect on their own histories, is in these 376 people that were on this ship, obviously you're not going to agree with everything that every single one of those people did all the time. Obviously, all 376 of them are not going to be saint-like figures. When you're looking into your own history, is that if you allow yourself to look into the discomfort, as opposed to, like, force upon valorization of that story, it really kind of sensitizes you to, I think, the politics of now, and activism, and, like, collectivism and community. For my own experience, the uncomfortable story, the project I'm working on right now, Paival, it goes into my great-grandfather's brother's autobiography. And he lived through partition, and he wrote his entire story down. It's incredible. I've never been able to look into a personal family document before, like from the time, a contemporary document. And he writes things about partition that are, I reading them, like my hair stood up, because I was like, ooh, that's uncomfortable for me. Like, these ex-family members may have done something that I feel like was very questionable, or it doesn't sit right with me. But when you think about it, like, I wasn't living back then, right? I have no idea. I from my position of privilege, I have no idea what it's like to live through partition and that violence on the ground. So, like, it was this moment of like really bringing history to life in front of my eyes for me. Once I accepted that this doesn't define who these people were and the relationships that I might have had with them or their descendants after that. This was a snapshot of them in that moment of time, making decisions that I could never possibly understand, but at least I can begin to now, because I can accept that it happened.
Mm-hmm. Well, thanks for sharing that, Paneet.
So I guess the call then is asking people to figure out how they can lean into their own discomfort.
It's a great way
right?
to put it. Yeah.
Because you're totally right. We hesitate on the podcast to tell certain stories because it's not our story to tell. Or there's certain things that individuals really need to feel comfortable acknowledging, working through, and figuring out how they want to tell those stories. So I guess the call out is lean into your discomfort a little if you're willing.
Great. And with that, I want to thank all three of you for joining us, Monsoon Arts Festival, today for this panel conversation on podcasts and samosa politics in BC. So thank you, Milan, Paneet, and Naveen, and thank you everyone who's watched us for this social distancing panel, which is very different for all of us this year. It's really strange to talk straight to a camera instead of a live audience. To learn more about the podcast, please listen, download, subscribe to the Nameless Collective Podcast. We're on Apple Podcasts, iTunes, Spotify, and Stitcher, and pretty much everywhere you listen to a podcast online. And we will also be coming very soon to Amazon Music.
Cool.
Yeah. So, and you can also find more information on the podcast and some documents from past seasons on jugnistyle.com/thenameless. And if you have any questions or have like a really interesting story or family documents or even a rumor or some gossip that you want to share with us that you think would make some great content, email us at hello@jugnistyle.com. I want to thank the Monsoon Arts Festival for hosting us this year, and be sure to check out more of their events. I don't know their website.
monsoonartsfest.ca.
Delete what I just said.
That's cool.